One of the first images that comes to mind when thinking of ancient Rome is slavery. The common belief is that a Roman master had unlimited, unquestionable control over their slave. They could punish, torture, or even kill them and face no consequences. To be honest, this assumption isn't entirely fictional. In Roman law, slaves were not considered human but speaking tools. Still, it would be an oversimplification to say that every master could do absolutely anything to any slave at any time without facing consequences. So what really limited a master's power? What were these restrictions? How did they work, and when did they come into play? At the same time, how was a person priced in a slave market like the one at Forum Boarium? Why did a Greek child cost 1,500 denarii, while a worn-out Thracian farmer was only worth 500 denarii? Let's take a closer look at these two striking aspects of Roman slavery. Slavery in Rome existed for over 12 centuries, from the time of the city's legendary founder Romulus to the fall of the Western Empire. During this long period, the legal status of slaves and the laws governing them evolved significantly. In its early days, Rome was a small, modest town with a low population, and slaves were even fewer. Even the wealthiest Romans were landowners who worked their fields by hand, or often with only a few slaves. This made the relationship between master and slave more personal, and at times, surprisingly friendly. It was much harder to be cruel to someone you labored alongside every day. Yet this closeness carried risks. A master who lacked understanding toward a slave might find an unexpected strike from a hoe across his back. Moreover, escape was a real option in the early period. A neighboring tribe or settlement was only half a day's walk away. Losing a slave was easy, finding them was almost impossible. This partly explains why early Roman masters tended to treat their slaves with relative leniency. But as Rome expanded and wars brought waves of captives, the dynamics changed. By the 5th century BCE, slaves made up about 20% of the Roman population and had become indispensable to the economy. From that point on, treatment of slaves steadily worsened. Throughout the Republic, no legal upper limit restricted a master's authority over a slave. In practice, Roman masters could treat their slaves however they wished. For protection, the only albeit weak hope came from the censors. These powerful officials had the authority to intervene and even punish a master in cases of extreme cruelty. But this was a right, not a duty. Censors were not detectives and did not routinely check how slaves were treated. Slaves had no legal right to appeal to a censor. Only a free citizen could report mistreatment. Even then, the censor could completely ignore the complaint. The office of the censor was not permanent. They were elected every 5 years and served only 18 months. This left 3.5 years without oversight. In more than 400 years, from the creation of the censor's office to the rise of the empire, there is not a single recorded case of a censor intervening to protect a slave. During the imperial period, there are 2 well-known cases where emperors, who also held censorial power, personally intervened. In one case, the knight Vettius Pollio wanted to punish a slave who accidentally broke an expensive crystal cup by throwing him into a pool of lampreys. Emperor Augustus, present at the scene, intervened. He saved the slave's life and granted him freedom. In the second case, Emperor Hadrian exiled a Roman matron named Umbria from the city for 5 years. She had brutally beaten a slave girl over a trivial matter. These rare examples highlight an important truth. Although censors and emperors technically had the authority to protect slaves, they hardly ever used it unless the violence was public and undeniable. Early on, a few new laws began to provide minimal legal protection for slaves and to set some limits on masters' unchecked cruelty. The Lex Fufia, Caninia 2 CE, and the Lex Aelia Sentia 4 CE were enacted to regulate manumission and to limit how many slaves could be freed at once through a will. Later, during the reign of Emperor Claudius, a law was introduced stating that if a master abandoned a sick slave and the slave recovered without help, they would automatically gain freedom. The master was also obliged to bury a deceased slave. If he refused and someone else performed the burial, the costs could be recovered from the master through legal action. In 61 CE, the Lex Petronia prohibited masters from forcing their slaves to fight wild animals without a judge's approval. Emperors Domitian and later Hadrian banned the castration of slaves. During the reign of Emperor Antoninus Pius, in the 140s century, the wrongful killing of slaves was prohibited. A master found guilty of intentionally killing his own slave was subject to the same legal standards as if he had killed someone else's slave. Such a master faced a fine and also had to pay the value of the killed slave. In 319 CE, Emperor Constantine's law equated killing a slave with killing a free person. However, both Constantine's and Antoninus Pius's laws held a master responsible only if the killing was intentional. This applied if a slave was stabbed, hanged, thrown from a great height, or fed to wild animals. On the other hand, if a slave died from punishments like whipping, considered normal in Roman society, the law did not hold the master accountable. Roman slave law dealt not only with punishment, but also with 4 standard clauses that could be added to slave sales contracts. These clauses provided surprising control over a slave's fate. Ne manumittatur, added at the seller's request, this clause forbade the buyer from freeing the purchased slave. If the seller sold an elderly slave unable to work, the clause ensured the slave received at least minimal care and support, since masters were obliged to care for their slaves, and many older slaves were freed to relieve their burden. Ut manumittatur. This clause required the buyer to free the slave at the end of the period specified in the sales contract. Ut exportatur. This clause obligated the buyer to move the purchased slave out of a specific city or region and forbade returning them. Even if later freed, returning to that area could result in re-enslavement. Ne prostituatur. This clause explicitly forbade the buyer from forcing a female slave into prostitution. These clauses remained legally binding even if the slave was resold. For example, if a buyer purchased a female slave with a ne prostituatur clause and then sold her without disclosing it, and the new owner forced her into prostitution, the courts could intervene. In such cases, the original buyer, not the seller, was held responsible. These contract clauses reflect that Roman law, despite its harshness towards slaves, sometimes acknowledged their vulnerability. They also reveal that some masters tried to impose lasting conditions to shape a slave's future, even after selling them. In Rome's slave markets, people were bought and sold as casually as we buy a new phone today. And just like us, the Romans loved paperwork. Every sale came with receipts for the money and written contracts documenting the handover of people. This gives us a window into the harsh daily reality of slavery in the Roman world. How was a slave's value determined? 500 denarii or 5,000? The Romans approached this question with ruthless logic, not emotion. People for them were assessed much like we evaluate livestock today. The main factors influencing price were origin and ethnicity. The Romans held strong, often stereotypical views about different ethnic groups. Greeks were seen as cultured, educated, and intelligent, making them highly sought for household tasks, childcare, or personal assistance. Gauls and Germans were valued for their physical strength and endurance, bought for heavy labor on farms, construction, or mines. Easterners, such as Syrians and Phoenicians, were known for their skills in craftsmanship, trade, and finance, and were purchased to manage estates or profitable businesses. Skills and education. An unskilled laborer was at the bottom of the price scale, while a slave with valuable craftsmanship, literacy, or classical education Especially mastery of Latin and other languages was far more valuable. A basic slave might cost a few hundred denarii, a skilled shoemaker 4,000, a doctor 20,000, the price of a small house in Rome. A chef, specializing in exotic recipes, could cost 100,000, the price of a fully equipped country estate, and according to some sources, a famous Greek actor could fetch an astonishing 700,000 denarii. Age. Slaves aged 15 to 25 were the most expensive, mature enough to work hard, but young enough to serve for decades. Children around 10 were seen as good investments, suitable for training and loyal. After 25, value began to decline. By 40, a slave might be worth half their peak value, and by 60, perhaps only a symbolic 100 denarii. Older slaves were often freed to relieve the costs of care. Physical attributes and health. For laborers, strength was everything. Slaves were tested by lifting heavy stones at the markets. Lameness, disability, or chronic illness significantly reduced the price. For household slaves, standards were entirely different. Beauty was central, especially for young girls and boys. Fair skin and hair and symmetrical facial features were valued. Exotic appearances like blonde Britons or dark-skinned Ethiopians could increase the price. Gender. Healthy adult males were seen as the most common and versatile workforce, constantly in demand and maintaining stable prices. Women were assessed on a more complex set of criteria. Beyond labor potential, youth, beauty, virginity, and fertility could create value far beyond their working capacity. A young, attractive woman might sell for 6,000 denarii, while a male of the same age might fetch only 2,000. Women specialized in roles like wet nurses or midwives carried an additional price premium. Slave prices were also shaped by supply and demand. The biggest factor was war. After successful campaigns, Roman legions returned with thousands of captives, flooding the markets and driving prices down. After Caesar's Gallic Wars, it is estimated that nearly 1 million slaves entered the market. During long periods of peace, prices would rise. Location was also important. Rome, with its wealthy buyers and constant demand, had the highest prices. A slave might sell for 2,000 denarii in the capital, while in a frontier town, the same slave could fetch only 800. So how can we convert these ancient prices into modern terms? Honestly, it isn't easy, and there is no single correct answer. Converting ancient prices to modern currency is complex and relative. Different criteria such as silver content, purchasing power for food, or a soldier's salary can be used, yielding results from $2 to $200. Therefore, the most meaningful comparison relies on concrete economic data of the time. For example, the price of an unskilled male slave, 1,000 denarii, matched a legionary's annual salary, while a skilled slave doctor could be bought for the equivalent of a luxury villa, 20,000 denarii. Behind each price tag was a real human torn from their family, a craftsman forced to serve in a new master's home, or a young woman sold to a brothel. The slave market never stopped. It merely adapted, grew, and lasted over 1,000 years. Prices fluctuated, trends changed, but one thing remained constant. In ancient Rome, people were bought and sold, measured in coins, and listed in household records like property. Over time, some limits were placed on the power of masters, yet the harsh truth never changed. A human life always had a price tag. The roads, temples, and victories of the Roman Empire, all were in a way products of slave labor. Yet this system was built on a ruthless structure that reduced human life to price tags. The laws in Rome never fully protected slaves. They were seen not as humans, but as property. Still, the prevalence of slavery was an inseparable part of Rome's economic strength and social order. Looking back today, we see that behind Rome's splendor lay the sweat, suffering, and lost lives of countless nameless people. A scene in a slave market does not reveal the glory of Roman civilization. It exposes its dark side. If you enjoyed my video, please don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. See you in my next video. Take care. Goodbye.